we did experiments where we gathered selections of 500 Hebrew words to do these samples. I really struggled. I found the Arad Ostraca. I shoved in a lot of personal names to get up to 500 words because they're quite small. So they're only little tiny windows into what language would look like, where we actually have dated and localized language. And when we look at the inscriptions, you often hear people say, well, the inscriptions are just like early Hebrew in the Bible, and they prove that classical biblical Hebrew is early or something like that. But as I said, I found quite a few late biblical Hebrew features, but I find a ton of things in the inscriptions that are either really rare in the Bible or just not found at all. Here's something that I always keep coming back to. In our pre-exilic inscriptions, there's only a few things that we have quite a lot of. I mean, one thing that everyone accepts, as far as I know, is that all of our biblical texts are written in a later style of spelling. And supposedly early Hebrew, you've got like Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah. Yahu is the divine element at the end of a word, or you get Yirmiyah. Yirmiyahu is supposed to be early, Yirmiyah is supposed to be late. We have a solid number of names, especially from the northern part of Israel, which end in Yao. So in other words, not Yahu, but Yao, a contracted form. And they're relatively well attested in our pre-exilic inscriptions. There is not one of them in any biblical text. We never ever get a Yao name turning up in a biblical text.
Really? This might all be post-exilic, because the way this name is spelled with Yao at the end, and it's common for pre-exilic times, and then you just don't find that anymore in any of the biblical text. That's kind of like not a really good sign that this is pre-exilic. It makes it look like it's post-exilic.
Yeah, it makes it look like post-exilic, or that it's been solidly edited in the post-exilic periods. And it really shows that the author had a mastery of classical language, classical Hebrew style, that he can write really good classical Hebrew, but with some Qumran peculiarities to it.
Today, my special guest is Ian Young, Ph.D. from the University at Sydney, currently the Professor of Biblical Studies and Ancient Languages at Australian Catholic University. Ian Young, his entire career, has been trying to blow the whistle and tell his fellow colleagues in biblical studies that the entire paradigm of how we date the Bible is flawed, and he has written works on this subject, such as Biblical Hebrew, Studies in Chronology and Typology, and Linguistic Dating of Biblical Texts, we co-wrote with Robert Rezetko. We are going to talk about this subject in depth for the next hour. As I've said before on this channel, the Mount Rushmore of scholars who are showing and demonstrating that the Hebrew Bible is not as old as we think are the late Russell Gmirkin, 2. Gad Barnea, the historian, 3. Jonathan Adler, the archaeologist. And here we are with Ian Young with linguistics as the 4th member of the Mount Rushmore. Stay tuned and buckle up. You are about to attain true gnosis.
And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And joining me today is a scholar who's been highly anticipated on this channel for people following me, Professor of Biblical Studies and Ancient Languages at Australian Catholic University since 2023, Ian Young. I came across your work from actually Russell Gmirkin, the late Russell Gmirkin, who just passed away recently, was sending me links to your work years ago, because I'm in constant back and forth with other scholars and other YouTubers about the conversation of dating of the Hebrew Bible. And one of the main criticisms towards minimalism, and whatever you want to call it, is biblical dating of linguistics. And so it was immediately, Gmirkin was like, you have to read Ian Young. He's just going to cut through the BS. And boy, was he right. So I'm glad to get you on. And I was telling my audience that I'm going to make a Mount Rushmore of biblical scholars who are the best at showing the problems of dating the Hebrew Bible past, like going back very old or archaic. And the first one was Russell Gmirkin, who comes at it from a comparative religion, more of a philosophical way. He's trying to figure out what are they doing? Are they inspired by Plato? legalities, legal systems. He's coming at it from that angle. Then you have Gad Barnea, who's a historian, comes at it from a historian angle, different methodology, different approach. Then you have Jonathan Adler, archaeologist, comes at it from the archaeology point of view, completely rigorous and scientific. And he's saying Judaism is a product of the 2nd century BC, whereas Gad and Americans say 3rd century, maybe even a little before that. And then you are coming at it from a completely different angle, the 4th member of the Mount Rushmore, Ian Young. You come at it from the linguistic standpoint, which is like this is very important for this conversation, because without you, this whole thing might fall apart, because they have some good arguments against minimalism as far as dating the Hebrew Bible. And so you come at it from a linguistic standpoint, and your work kind of shows the problems with dating the Bible by linguistics. So if someone watching this right now who just can get a little introduction on your work and your hypotheses and what you found in your studies, that would be great. And I'm glad to have you here.
Yeah, great. I'm really happy to hear that I'm on the mountain. That's always exciting to be there. Yeah, that's right. It's a discussion that's been going on for like 25 or more years. You're right to identify the minimalist discussion in the 1990s. They're starting this argument against late dating of biblical texts based on linguistic arguments. So if I can give that side of the argument first of all. So talking about Russell Gmerkin, unfortunately Russell passed away recently, great guy. But also talking about also someone else who just passed away recently, Professor Avi Hurvitz from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and mentor of mine early in my career, and a really nice guy, really, really helpful scholar. He authoritatively put together this argument, which is basically this. I'll give you the basic argument, then we can talk about some of the problems that I see with it. So the argument in its most simple form is this: we know what late Hebrew, that is Hebrew of the post-exilic period, 6th, 5th century onwards, looks like, because we have some books that we know for sure have to be from the post-exilic period. That is, they mention events or people from the post-exilic period. So the classic late biblical Hebrew books are Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So we know for sure that they're post-exilic, and they have some linguistic peculiarities that they share with each other. Now, not necessarily every one of the books, but they have a peculiarity in their linguistic profile with each other. And so, for just one example, they might, when they talk about a kingdom, they'll use the Hebrew word malchut rather than say the word mamlaka, which other texts would use. And so, Hurvitz's argument is this: we know what late Hebrew looks like because it's the language of those books. If you have other books, like, say, the priestly source in the Pentateuch or Samuel or anything else, if it's not like those books, it has to be early. That's the basic argument. And so that's the core of the argument, that if you're trying to date these books late, well, they're not in late biblical Hebrew. Therefore, because they're not like the language of those 5 books, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. And therefore, if they're not like that, that's the only sort of Hebrew that existed in that late period, and therefore they must be early. That's, in a nutshell, the basic argument.
Wow. Okay. So basically, from what I've gathered, I've one of my friends who's an academic and who's on the other side of the argument was pointing me to Jan Houston, and then was like saying, this was like there's a whole paradigm that was brought forth by Jan Houston. Unfortunately, Jan Houston ended up getting in some trouble, but we're not going to get into that right now. But you also pointed out that there's another scholar recently, is Hornkohl.
Yeah.
Hornkohl. And this is a scholar who's succeeded a previous academic from the school of, what was the other scholar's name? Hurvitz?
Hurvitz, that's right. Hurvitz. Yes, that's right.
Hurvitz. And so this is like the paradigm of what you find in a student of divinity school will learn from these people. They're going to learn what they say and their arguments. And basically what it is when we're reading the Pentateuch, you can see there's specific language being used that indicates it's older. And then there's parts of the Hebrew Bible, even in the Pentateuch itself, that suggest editorial changes because it's using different vocabularies and grammar and stuff like that. And so Hornkohl is very confident, extremely confident, that we can know for sure, just by linguistics, when this stuff was written. And so you've actually written an article arguing against this. I have a link for the description. It's called "Isn't It Time to Break Up with Linguistic Dating? Rethinking Hornkohl's Method." And one of the things that I grasped from your article is that it's great. It's obvious. He's obviously knows his stuff. Like, what's not like, this is not an idiot. This is like really good work as far as like categorizing different languages being used, but it's flawed. And so I will, and you've given some reasons, and I can try to summarize, but I'd like to hear from you. What is flawed about it?
Yeah, for sure. That's right. So there's two ways that we approach this. First of all, was within the method itself, because I mean, Hornkohl, as a student of Hurvitz, is basically carrying on the similar sort of methodology, etc., like that. So within the theory, then there's the big picture. Where I would start off these days, later in my life, 25 years on in the discussion, would be the idea that we can use the language of the traditional text in front of us as evidence of what the original authors wrote is flawed, because all of our evidence indicates that ancient scribes didn't copy those peculiar linguistic features carefully over time. And so the basic presumption would be, if we're dating a book, say 700 BCE or something like that, if we're dating it there, that the book that we have in front of us reflects all the details of the language that were written down by that particular author back in 700 BCE. But as soon as you bring into the equation that every scribe, when they copied it, changed those peculiar linguistic features, then what we have in our text, because we don't get biblical text until the 3rd, 2nd century BCE. Once we start getting biblical text, if we've had scribes intervening for those centuries and changing the language, in what way can the features of the language in those late texts actually give us evidence for what the original author wrote? And want to emphasize, we're talking here about peculiarities. Now, you'll get the same big picture linguistic forms, like basic features of the Hebrew verb system. They're copied the same all the way through. They don't particularly change. But it's the unusual, less common features. I'm not saying rare, but just less common features that mark these books off as being peculiar. And so what they're claiming is that a very small number of minor details of the text have been copied so exactly over many, many centuries that they that they can give us evidence of this is exactly what the original author wrote. Now, there's a number of bits of evidence. There's the general scholarly consensus in textual criticism that our texts were very fluid in the BCE period. That is, there's a lot of variation in large-scale details, even just different editions of the biblical books. But here we're talking about very minor details. That is the language. And so there's a number of ways of coming at this. We've done a lot of work looking at variant forms of Hebrew, like in Qumran, Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, where you get different linguistic profiles. But that's not necessarily something that necessarily all scholars like, because they often have a favoring for the traditional Masoretic text of the Bible, and so they want there's only like the traditional text that's in our Bibles now. Well, that's kind of like the original text. Dead Sea Scrolls is just weird. Let's forget about them. So what I looked at, here's one thing I like to talk about. In the Masoretic text itself, we get these parallel passages where you get the same thing in two different places. Like Psalm 18 is 2 Samuel 22. It's the same manuscript. Now, if you look at these less common, peculiar linguistic features in Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 22, in the poetry there, only about 7% of them are found in both texts. So even the same text in the Masoretic text that's come through, almost none of these unusual language features are the same as each other.
Really? Yeah. So this suggests, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're basically, what you're saying is these texts were copied and edited and redacted and interpolated and changed for centuries and centuries and centuries, that the text is so muddy, the water is so muddied now, that we there's no original layer anymore. It's all just completely been like fudged. It's all complete. It's almost impossible to find any original quote unquote layer.
In terms of that sort of lower level of all the peculiarities of the language, etc., like that, it is completely muddied. And the problem is, so in historical linguistics, historical linguists like texts that are dated and localized. In other words, we have an inscription from, like in English, we have enough sources that we can talk about the Lincolnshire dialect in the 13th century or something like that. We have nothing like that for Hebrew. Our inscriptions are really, really a very small amount. So we have very few data points that would allow us to know exactly what Hebrew looked at particular periods. All we have is these late copies of literary manuscripts, which is exactly what historical linguists would try to avoid in other fields of study. But that's all we've got in the Bible. We only have these literary manuscripts that have been copied over time. What you want to do really solid historical linguistics is to have data that you know when it was written, you know for sure when it was written, and where it was written. So we do have inscriptions, and we do find some interesting things. I found that there was quite a number of so-called late biblical Hebrew features already in pre-exilic Hebrew inscriptions, for example. We have some things that turn up in yeah, for sure. That's right. I actually found that
defeats the whole purpose of these categories then, doesn't it?
To some extent, but I mean, the basic theory itself admits that even with something that is supposedly a late biblical Hebrew feature of language, anything that's well attested will also turn up early. So that word malchut for kingdom turns up a few times in like Numbers and Samuel, etc., which are early texts. So the method itself isn't saying the mere appearance of a late Hebrew form proves that a text is late, because in that case everything is late. Right. And so it may or may not be. I want to emphasize we don't date early or late. We're just saying the language doesn't work for either of them. We're not tied to the Bible must be late. We're not tied to the Bible must be early. We're more talking about the methodology of how you date it. But right. So you've got so in the theory itself, what marks the late Hebrew is having a large accumulation of these late biblical Hebrew features. And so but it's never actually specified in the methodology how many makes it look like late biblical Hebrew. And so what we did was one of the other things we did was we did samples of like 500 Hebrew words from all over the place, and just counted how many of these supposedly late biblical Hebrew forms happen. And it's quite correct that those 5 books, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, they have a lot of these late biblical Hebrew. I'm using late biblical Hebrew with quote marks. These late biblical Hebrew features, but we found that every other sample throughout the whole Bible or outside the Bible had a few of them, but you might have like 25 in Ezra and 6 in Samuel or something like that. So there's definitely, Hurvitz is right. These 5 books are different in their language in some way. They like these particular linguistic forms. But the big problem is not just that you get them in these early sources, you get them definitely in Hebrew inscriptions and books that are and compositions that are definitely late, like the Book of Ben Sira from the 2nd century BCE or the Qumran Pesher Habakkuk. They also have a very small number of these late biblical Hebrew features. So it's actually not true. Yeah, it's actually not true that the only way you could write Hebrew in the post-exilic period was like those 5 books. In fact, they look weird. We've played with the idea of calling them peripheral biblical Hebrew, whereas normal biblical Hebrew in the post-exilic period is not full of those late Hebrew features. And so it's an unspoken assumption of this linguistic dating argument that those 5 books are the only way you could write Hebrew in the post-exilic period. But our samples demonstrated that that's not the case. In fact, we found that the Arad Ostrika from the pre-exilic period had more late biblical Hebrew features than the Qumran Pesher Habakkuk, for example, from the 1st century BCE. So those are some of the things that even within the method itself, when you investigate it, we found that it didn't hold up. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest physical texts we have, pretty much. Correct. Yeah, that's of the Hebrew Bible. That's right.
Yeah, and so in those mundane texts that are not biblical, the ones that they wrote like about community laws and stuff, in those texts we find similar language as we find in like older archaic Hebrew Bible stuff?
It depends on the author, and some texts have a little bit more in common with the late biblical Hebrew ones, but nothing like the massive number of late biblical Hebrew features that we find there. But other texts like the Qumran Pesher Habakkuk, I spent a lot of time looking very much at that one because it has a low number of these late biblical Hebrew features, and it really shows that the author had a mastery of classical language. Even when he's quoting from the book of Habakkuk. He'll comment on it using another classical. He's not just dependent on what Habakkuk wrote. He's such a master of the of this classical Hebrew style that he can write really good classical Hebrew, but with some Qumran peculiarities to it. I'm not saying it's exactly the same.
It's like Lucian in the 2nd century AD, Atticizing, in a way.
Right. Yeah.
He's Atticizing. He's trying to sound like a Greek from 500 BC in a way. This would be like, let me get your thoughts. I'm going to get your opinion on this, because I think I've said this before, but I want to make sure I'm correct. And if I keep saying this, I want to make sure that this makes sense to you.
Yep.
It would be like someone who studied Shakespeare their entire life, and they were like a master of Shakespeare. They memorized Shakespeare. They know all the little quirks and how Shakespeare talks, the giveth and taketh and thou, and they know all that language. They studied it their entire life. And in fact, that's all they know. They grew up as a young child studying Shakespeare all the way up until their 50s. And this person could easily write a Shakespeare text and make it sound like it's been written in the 1600s. Is that kind of what you think is going? Maybe is that a possibility of what's going on here?
It's a possibility of what is going on here. Yeah, that's right. Certainly, I think that someone like the author of Qumran Pesher Habakkuk, who's my best example of someone who really knows what they're doing. I think their minds are just soaked in the scriptures. In other words, they're not even just. It's not like they've even consciously. I'm going to refer to Numbers here. I'm going to refer to Deuteronomy here. It's just in their head, and it just comes out in that particular style. You can. I don't think quite often. I don't think it's conscious even. They've just, as you've said, they've just absorbed the style, and so and depends. You can sometimes see what they're reading. Like one difference that I see in Pesher Habakkuk to say the book of Samuel is that Pesher Habakkuk's clearly been reading the book of Proverbs. So every so often a Proverbs word will turn up there that you wouldn't necessarily get used in the book of Samuel as well, for example. But it's classical Hebrew, but it's their own particular mixture of what have they been reading. And some of the things they've been reading, of course, are the book of Daniel, which have a lot of these late biblical Hebrew features in them. So you will get late biblical Hebrew features also coming out in the Qumran scrolls. But in terms of the accumulation, the number of them, you're just not getting the scale of the amount of them that you would get in those 5 books: Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, those so-called late biblical Hebrew books. Yeah.
When you compare the prophets to like the Torah, for example, the Pentateuch, is there something, is one of them more archaic than the other? What's the deal with those two?
In terms of the problem is what do we mean by archaic? Since we don't have the pegs to know what's really early and what's later, it's very difficult often to go on.
Can you just explain that, the problem that we're already dealing with from the get-go? Like, we have nothing to go off. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, the problem is our I think so. I saw some statistics. The corpus of classical Hebrew, that is the Hebrew of the BCE period, is, I think, something like, I'm making part of these numbers up, but it's going to sound convincing anyway. So let's say there's like 83% of that is Hebrew Bible. Then about 16% is Qumran scrolls, maybe about 15% or something like that. And they're all literary manuscripts. Then maybe 2% of the corpus is Hebrew inscriptions from the pre-exilic period, those sort of inscriptions where we have them dated and localized. I really struggle. Remember I said we did experiments where we gathered selections of 500 Hebrew words to do these samples. I really struggled I found the Ehrensvärd. I shoved in a lot of personal names to get up to 500 words because they're quite small. So they're only little tiny windows into what language would look like, where we actually have dated and localized language. So, and when we look at the inscriptions, you often hear people say, well, the inscriptions are just like early Hebrew in the Bible, and they prove that Classical Biblical Hebrew is early or something like that. Whereas I said, I found quite a few late Biblical Hebrew features, but I find a ton of things in the inscriptions that are either really rare in the Bible or just not found at all. Here's something that I always keep coming back to. So in our pre-exilic inscriptions, there's only a few things that we have quite a lot of. I mean, one thing that everyone accepts, as far as I know, is that all of our biblical texts are written in a later style of spelling than our pre-exilic inscriptions. So there's certain features that are that clearly become more common, like just adding vowel letters, extra, like a letter Y for an I vowel or something like that. That becomes, all of our biblical manuscripts are clearly later than what we get in our pre-exilic inscriptions. So we can verify that at least the spelling that layer of spelling is later than what we're getting in the inscriptions. I believe that every side of the debate agrees with that, but it's difficult to go beyond that and find things where we get enough evidence to be sure that we have a pattern of what pre-exilic Hebrew might have looked like, so we can compare it with the Bible. But here's one attempt at that. We have personal names, and supposedly early Hebrew, you've got like Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah. Yahu is the end is the divine element at the end of a word, or you can get Yirmiyah. You can get Yirmiyahu or Yirmiyah. Yirmiyahu is supposed to be early, Yirmiyah is supposed to be late. That doesn't necessarily work within the biblical sources, and in our inscriptions we get both Yahu and Yah names, but mostly Yahu. Okay, but that's not why my point here. Everyone in the linguistic dating ignores another part. We have a solid number of names, especially from the northern part of Israel, which end in Yao. So in other words, not Yahu, but Yao, a contracted form. And they're relatively well attested in our pre-exilic inscriptions. There is not one of them in any biblical text. We never, ever get a Yao name turning up in a biblical text.
Really?
And you would think somewhere, if they were just preserving what was written in the pre-exilic period without change, somewhere you would get a Yao name turning up. You never, ever do. So it's clear that, for me, is part of the evidence that
that's a big deal.
With serious editing. Yeah,
that sort of indicates that this might all be post-exilic, because if you're saying that there's the way this name is spelled with Yao at the end, and it's common for pre-exilic times, and then you just don't find that anymore in any of the biblical text, that's kind of like not a really good sign that this is pre-exilic. It makes it look like it's post-exilic.
Yeah, it makes it look like post-exilic, or that it's been solidly edited in the post-exilic period. So I don't misunderstand what we're saying. We're not proving by the language that it has to be late. The form that we're getting it in, there's a lot of features that indicate it's been updated and changed in the late period. That isn't a decisive argument that the text that something like Samuel isn't, say, pre-exilic or something like that. We're just saying that the linguistic argument doesn't demand that it has to be early and doesn't demand that it has to be late as well, because the linguistic evidence, as you put it before, is so muddied. The waters are so muddied, and because we don't have those fixed points, I'm sure in the Bible that we get some early language, we get some later language, we get things from different geographical places, but it's not easy for us to be able to pull apart what's early, what's late, because everything's mixed together, and we don't have those sort of fixed points where we can go, well, that was added early, that was added late. So that muddying is, I think, what a major point that that we would emphasize. And by we, I should say, I'm not using the royal plural here much for myself, much as I would like to do that. I'm talking about, I've written a lot of stuff with also with Robert Rezetko and Martin Ehrensvärd. So if I ever use we, I'm fairly conceited anyway, but I'm not actually talking about myself as royalty. I'm actually referring to us as a group there. So when we've worked at these things, we would really emphasize, one of our major points would be how muddied our textual evidence is, because that's the nature of late copies of literary text, which is what we get in the biblical text and what we get in the Qumran as well. And as I said, in historical linguistics, they will try to avoid using those sort of texts because of that acknowledged problem that people will have changed them during scribal transmission.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we all agree on both sides of this debate is that every single book in the Bible from Genesis all the way down to Nehemiah, whatever the last book is, all of them have some degree of Persian editing, Persianisms, like some sort of influence of Persianisms, and then even Hellenistic. All of them have some degree of evidence that they were being edited all the way up until the Hellenistic period and through the Hellenistic period at some degree, right?
I would certainly hold that, and I think that's mainstream scholarship, that there is this ongoing process of editing, scribal transmission going on. I don't know whether you'd find absolutely every scholar who thinks that. I do get the impression from some scholars that they are more in the idea that the Masoretic text as we have it in front of us is basically what left the pen of original authors. And so some fairly well-known scholars have basically said that. So there is this idea, especially amongst scholars that we deal with in the linguistic dating side of it, do tend to have that by necessity, have that very conservative idea that things haven't changed as much as you might think. And of course, we know for sure that there wasn't late editing. You know why? Because it's not in late biblical Hebrew. So again, the linguistic argument,
it's circular.
Yeah, it's circular because
it's so silly.
Yeah, you can't possibly write late Hebrew. You can't write early Hebrew in the late period. You know why? Because nobody did. It can get that circular, the argument. Yeah,
it's textbook. What I get from people on that side of the debate is a textbook question begging fallacy. It's not true. These are not later because they're not later. Like, it's literally what it comes down to. Like, they just assert the conclusion as why it can't be true. It's very strange how you get stuck. You can see that happening. But even like Isaiah, everyone thinks Isaiah has this old it's like, I think there's 3 parts of Isaiah that most scholars think. And then you can see the later additions to Isaiah where it mentions King Cyrus by name. King Cyrus would not have been known to anybody in the time of Isaiah, 7th century, whatever it is, BC. And so the prophet, like, okay, you might be completely on the fundamentalist side. And well, it was a prophecy. He figured, like, that's not how prophecy worked in the ancient world. They're very vague. The bull will be slayed, and then who's the bull? Oh, it might be Cyrus. It might be someone else. So, but like, this would be a very weird prophecy to get right. Now, most scholars who are level-headed, and even on doesn't matter if they believe or not believe, will agree. Naming King Cyrus is evidence that it was written later. It was written after King Cyrus, probably. And so that right there is like full stop. We know Isaiah has even if it does have an older layer, we know it was edited later on. And the form that we have it in is probably from what I gather from scholars, the final form that we have it in is somewhere in the Hellenistic period. Okay. Now let's stick with this for a second. Homer, when we date Homer to when it starts showing up in the sources, when it starts showing up in archaeology. We have artworks with Homer scenes on them from like the 6th century, I think early 7th century BCE. Nestor's cup is one of them. And Homer uses language that some scholars on the classicist side have pointed out to me, that there's parts of Homer that look like it's like Mycenaean Greek old layers in Homer. But you know what no one ever does? No one dates Homer to that period. That would be silly. They date Homer to the 8th century. They don't go, we found this layer in Homer that looks like it's very archaic. It looks like, so let's date Homer to 1100 BC now. This type of mindset only happens in biblical scholarship circles, where they take the oldest layer and date the text based on the oldest layer, or even if they can't prove it, if it's just like a hypothetical, we think this is the oldest layer. We think it matches 800 BC. There we go. We're going to date to that period. When really you should be dating things by the final form, right?
Yeah, that's the question. What are we even dating? I mean, that's a really what you just said there is a really fundamental question. I mean, because I think it's anachronistic simply to say, let's date this biblical book in this period. That's not the way that biblical books work. I mean, mainstream scholarship, as you said, thinks that these books have developed over time. So was this book written in the Persian period? Yes. Was it written in the Hellenistic period? Yes. Was it written in maybe some books were they written in the pre-exilic period? The answer to all those questions is probably yes. But it's what do we mean written? The current form that we have are these late literary copies from 3rd, 2nd, 1st century BCE. That's kind of like, and so I tend to be very cautious about arguing back from there, just because of the nature of I want to have actual texts in front of me that I know where they've come from. I remember early in my career, I read someone's PhD thesis where they were talking about scholarship around 1900 in ancient Near East, and looking at what everyone knew was true in 1900, almost nothing now is considered to be true. And I'm thinking, okay, if I want to do something in scholarship that will last, I need to be talking about real texts, not about hypothetical texts. Now, I'm not saying you can't jump backwards from this text a stage, but when you start jumping back multiple stages and you end up, I'm inferring this, and then on that base I'm inferring that, then I get really scared of that. So maybe on the very cautious end as a scholar anyway, I like to talk about what we actually have rather than hypothetical stages of the development of these texts. But what I can see is that these texts are highly fluid when they enter into history in those last centuries BCE. So it just doesn't make sense to me that what we have now is going to be the same as what we had hundreds of years earlier. I mean, people argue, and I've been involved with this discussion as well, that something like Exodus 15 or Song of Deborah, Judges 5, these poems are archaic, and therefore we can date them before 1000 BCE. It's just on the basis of a few linguistic items in them. For me, that's the height of absurdity, knowing how fluid these linguistic features are throughout time, that we've argued that they've somehow stayed the same over 1,000 years. So I've tried to come up with other ways of looking at why that poetry is a little bit different to other poetry that we might get. But again, it's basically agreeing with what you're saying. That is, the whole question of what are we dating, or the whole question about when was that book written, I think is an anachronistic question. It's coming from our understanding of how books work, not how ancient people thought that books work.
Yeah, because the oldest physical copies we have are from the first, maybe early 2nd century BC at the latest. Maybe at the earliest. That's the oldest physical text we have. So one of the things you pointed out in your book and in your articles is that, like, instead of just taking linguistic dating as in a vacuum to date these texts, we have to take a step back and look at all the evidence as a whole, more of like a big picture. Like, does the linguistic? Okay, we have linguistic analysis, and this text, this part of Genesis looks different than this part of Genesis. Cool, we all agree on that. But what about other evidence? What about archaeology? What about primary sources citing the Bible? When do people start citing the Bible? Well, the answer to that is like way later in the Hellenistic period. No one even knows. The first person in Greek to talk about it is maybe Hecataeus of Abdera, if you accept the fragments as authentic. But that might even be after that. It might even be somewhere in the 200s BC. And then you have, like Jonathan Adler points out, enforcement, because the Torah is a lot of laws. It's a way of life. It's enforcement. It's people should do this. People should do this. Priests should do this. Priests should do that. And so if this text was already floating around, who is it written for? Is it just written for a group of priests that by themselves that are just hypothetically coming up with like what kind of like Plato's Republic? Like, maybe this would be the best way to rule, and then no one knows about it though? That's a really strange thing. Like, what about the people on the ground, the farmers, the soldiers, the coal miners, whatever? What do they know about this stuff yet? And as Jonathan and Gad point out, in the archaeology, the answer is no. Gad points out that no one's naming their children after, like you find in Greek sources and Egyptian sources, they name their children after the heroes in the literature. So like Apollodorus is named after Apollo. And then Gad points out in his work that nobody's naming their children after Moses and Abraham and some of the major figures in the Torah until after 300 BCE. And he said you start seeing an explosion of people naming their children. And then Jonathan Adler points out the enforcement of Torah is nowhere in any of the archaeology until the Maccabean period, 160s. So then, okay, now we take a whole big holistic approach of everything. Well, and then what you're pointing out the problems of linguistic dating, they're pointing out the problems with archaeology. He's pointing out the problems with the historical record and the citations and the primary sources. All of a sudden, this is not looking good for an older dating of this stuff.
Yeah, that's right, and you're right that the work that you've talked about there, Jonathan Adler and Gad Barnett, etc., like that, very interesting things that I read and think about, especially like that. So you're right that one of the things we're arguing for is that because sometimes you get the impression that the linguistic daters want to say that language trumps absolutely everything. It's the Joker in the pack. Bang! You can't beat that one there. But what we've argued is obviously the language is evidence, right? It's not we're not dismissing the whole thing, but we're just saying it's a lot more complex than it's just the Joker that proves that everything is early or late, depending on which argument you're using there. So we've also definitely joined in with other scholars saying it's got to be just part of a holistic view of how you date traditions, how you date when the texts are coming together, the whole history of how they're coming together. There's a lot of question marks there. So we're definitely feeding in. As I said, as I've emphasized to you, people do think sometimes have come up to us and said, they've actually called us, "You're minimalists." In other words, because we've come in and said, "Oh, you can't use that argument to date things early." They've said, "Oh, you must be dating everything late." But other times we've come in and said, "You can't use that evidence to date that late." People should call us maximalists then, because our engagement, whatever, because especially myself and Robert and Martin, we will have different views on dating and questions like that. What we agree on is this methodological issue that the language is only part of the picture. You can't just use it as the one true method that will answer all of our questions and we can forget everything else. And so that's really what I would emphasize. I'm very interested in the idea that the Torah is only starting to be actually used by the majority of people in the Hasmonean period, for example. So I wrote a book review of Adler's book, for example. So I've been engaging with it. So I find those really interesting arguments there, and certainly I'm very interested in that. And from my humble little corner, I would say, well, if that's the way that the evidence goes, I don't think the language can trump that. That is that it's only one part of this bigger picture.
Yeah, even Israel Finkelstein, one of the great archaeologists over in Israel, was speaking at an event, and he brought up Jonathan Adler's late book, The Origins of Judaism.
A review on a book which has recently been published on the emergence of Judaism, something like this. Yes, here we have to make a distinction, and I support the same kind of, the same idea. I make a distinction between, Judaitism, can I say this? Judaite culture and Judaism. These are the same things in a process, but not exactly the same things. So Judaism, as we understand today, Jewish law comes, in my opinion, rightly following this book that has recently been published from the time of the Hasmoneans in the 2nd century BC, but it doesn't mean that there are no roots back in the Iron Age and in monarchic times. Of course there are, but we are speaking about a process, and it is important to say we are now striding into a minefield, of course, but I'm striding into a minefield. But it also depends on the question of the final composition of the Torah. And here there are different opinions. And, most scholars today would say that the final compositions, the priestly material, especially, and post-priestly material in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, comes from the Persian or early Hellenistic times. In my opinion, perhaps even slightly later, perhaps. So I hope that but anyway, this is what we see here is the Israelite culture of the Iron Age at Megiddo, and then Judahite culture of the Iron Age. So I specifically Judahite, and we cannot call these people Jews yet, in my opinion, at least.
And I've been curious to hear what he thinks about this, because I've heard him in the past kind of go with like the more, not the consensus, but almost in that direction. I'm not the consensus, the traditional approach. Even though in his book, the what is it called? The Archaeology of Israel, I think it's called. But anyways, in his book, he points out that there's like the literary tradition of Israel is probably after 800 BC, mostly at the latest 900 BC. That's like when like writing starts in that part of the world, according to the archaeology. And he was saying like, and then he pointed out Jonathan. I read Jonathan's book. He goes, I agree 100% with what he's saying. And he's like, I think I would even go farther than that. I think it might even been after he said something along those lines. It might even been after that. And I was like, okay, so even he's agreeing with this. I'm seeing a lot of people be persuaded by this new way of looking at everything. But okay, so the reason why I brought up Homer before is because it's so funny how we special plead for the books that we really find to be important for our culture. Like, we love the Bible. We're a Christian culture, mostly Christian, Jewish, and most of our culture is between those two. And so we want the Bible to be historically correct, even if we don't believe in the miracles. We're kind of rooting for it. We're kind of like, yeah, like let's get it to be right. But no one, when we look at dating Homer, we take the holistic approach. We go, okay, linguistic wise, looks pretty old, Ionian, archaic Greek that you don't find anywhere else. In fact, Hoplok's Legonoma, there's a whole chunk of Homer that's literally only in Homer.
Homeric Greek has almost 3,000 hapax legomena. What's a hapax legomenon, you ask? Hapax means once, and legomenon means that thing I just freaking said. So a hapax legomenon is a word that is used only once, one time, in the whole literature. Homeric Greek contains 9,000 unique words, 3,000 of which only ever occur one time. Let's do the math. That's a 3 to 9 ratio, simplifying to 1 to 3, that's
0.33, repeating of course.
So literally, 1/3 of your entire experience trying in vain to read Homer is to learn words that you will never, ever see again. Double gotcha! How's that for a little light reading? Don't even get me started on digamma. Why, Greek? Why?
Like, there's just a completely different category of Greek. So it's like, okay, that pushes it back far. But then you have to look at, well, how far back can we put Homer? Can we put Homer in the Bronze Age? It's talking about the Trojan War.
I mean, Homeric Greek is technically ancient Greek because, it's pretty dang old. But not only were the Iliad and the Odyssey written down by some blind guy, apparently, which, come to think of it, would explain the friggin' squiggly letters, a full 300 years before the beginning of the standard classical / Koine Greek that is typically taught, they're actually a combination of 36 or so Greek islands dialects and not even close to a coherent language, stretching back for centuries into the Dark Ages. No, not those Dark Ages. The OG Dark Ages. The Greek Dark Ages. These Dark Ages were so bad that everyone even forgot how to read and write, resulting in the pancreatic failure-inducing alphabet we suffer through today.
'Tis but a scratch.
Now that's dark.
The Bible talks about King David and King Solomon. That's supposed to be 900, 800 BC, right? Should we date it? Well, the same thing with Homer. It's in the Trojan War. It's in the Bronze Age. Should we date it to the Bronze Age? But the answer to that is no, because we don't see Homer being cited by anybody, being mentioned by anybody, being in any of the archaeology or any of the artworks or any of the vases or nothing until after the 8th century. So we date Homer according to the evidence. But I'm noticing with the Bible, they want to do this linguistic is the boss, linguistic is the trumps all, that we don't get that special pleading with Homer. And I one of the things that I wanted to get your thoughts on this is, like, in math, we do PEMDAS. I think this is a good way of looking at, like, methodology. In math, PEMDAS is parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. Now, if you start off with subtraction and then go to do addition and try to do division and you try to do backwards, the math will be wrong. You can't start off your math problem using the opposite. You have to do PEMDAS. That's why you're taught PEMDAS in, I think, elementary school. They teach PEMDAS, maybe middle school. Early on, everyone knows about PEMDAS, basic math. You start off with whatever the parentheses are. You figure that out first. Then you go into the exponents. Then you go into multiplication. Now, if you try to do a different direction, your math will be wrong. And I think when we're looking at the evidence of dating biblical text or dating any text, I think there should be a PEMDAS where it's like, number one, archaeology, hard evidence on the ground. That should be number one. That should be the one that trumps everything. We should start there, and then work our way down to linguistics towards the bottom of that list. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
It sounds reasonable to me. That again, that comes down to using what is, you've got all these possible methods. They got to work together. They can't just one just can't be right and all the rest are wrong. The linguistic dating itself tends to be opposed to, as I mentioned, mainstream scholarship, like on how fluid the text is, for example. It also tends to come to conclusions that are quite opposed to other scholarship. It's the early dating of the P document, the priestly document in the Pentateuch, for example, is quite regularly based on the linguistic evidence, and whereas other scholars who aren't so fussed on the linguistic evidence will date it to a much later period as well. So that's again that whole problem of taking just one part of the evidence. So I would totally agree that archaeology is very important, and that's really where I want my inscriptions. I want those archaeologists to find me more inscriptions, so I have more of a chronology in which I can actually talk about the history of Hebrew, for example. We just don't have the sources. Like Akkadian, they bake their stuff on mud bricks, so we got a million documents, and so we can trace what, just in letters, people have written books about how style and language changes over 2,000 years, because we have 2,000 years of letters. We have nothing like that for Hebrew, unfortunately, much as we would like to. So yeah, archaeology would be great. I'm just basically here agreeing with you that we need to bring all these things in dialogue with each other, and we can't just assume that one thing is the answer, because then you end up linguistic dating, as I said, usually comes up with answers that are opposed to the rest of scholarship. Like, I mean, Aaron Hornkohl, as you mentioned, is a really excellent scholar, really, really careful scholar, good guy as well. So we had he takes our work seriously and sort of tries to listen to what we're saying. But his conclusion in his most recent book, which is very tentative, however, is that the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible are written between 1000 and 800 BCE. That is, the whole Pentateuch is finished by 800 BCE. Now, pretty much no mainstream scholar is going to sign on for that. But that's what happens, I think, when you let language trump all the other possible arguments that might come into that equation. So that's another example where linguistic dating can be done really well by very competent scholars, and it will arrive at conclusions, if used on its own, that are opposed to what every other biblical scholar is saying. And so I think that's the problem of just using one method.
And that's why I think PEMDAS is a good analogy, because if you can do the math correctly, you can do the addition and the subtraction and the multiplication right. But if you're not doing the PEMDAS in the right order, your math's going to be wrong. But you did everything right like you did it all correctly according to your own, how you did the math, and it just didn't come out the correct way. I think that's why I brought that up. I also wanted to ask you about like some of these older inscriptions that we find. One of them is the Deir Alla, the Balaam inscription. Are you familiar with this one? Yeah. Now, this one gets thrown at me from some scholars from time to time as like evidence of the biblical text being older. Is this even Hebrew at all? What is this language, and what's your takeaway from this in comparison to the biblical text?
Yeah, Deir Alla text talking about the prophet Balaam, right? So there's been a whole discussion for decades. What exactly is it? Because the language has some Hebrew features, some Aramaic features, and it's one of these peripheral dialects which shows you that they're beautiful. There it is. Very fragmentary. This is the best part we have. It's beautiful. Interesting mixture of language, but it does show us that there's this, when the Bible in Numbers 22-24, I think it is, talks about Balaam as a character, that they're drawing on these older traditions. But for me, that would be all it definitely demonstrates, is that the Torah didn't just make up Balaam, but I mean it's Israeliting him. In that story, he's the prophet of pagan gods. I mean, the God of Israel isn't his God there. So he gets, but it shows that what we get in the prophetic books, because he has a dream, he has a vision where he sees disaster impending, and he passes it. It's very fragmentary, so we don't know exactly where it goes from there. So you get those general indications that the biblical tradition isn't just made up on the spot. Like, I mean, in Kings as well, the book of Kings has this king list, and generally the kings, when we get them in archaeology, they turn up in the right place at the right time or something like that. So no one's claiming that people just sat down, 300 BCE and thought, gee, we don't have a tradition. Let's come up with something. And so over 3 weeks of coffee, they came up with the Hebrew Bible or something like that. That usually people are thinking they're using older traditions. But the question is, is that, what does Balaam prove that it was written in, whatever, that was written 750 BCE or something like that? Or is it just demonstrating that those traditions are actual traditions that whenever our biblical books were put together, they were available and were brought together into that context? So for me, they prove what I believe, that the biblical tradition, no matter when we're going to date its composition, is definitely drawing on these older traditions. It wasn't just made up in a late period. But that's a different question to when were the books as we now have them, when did they come together in a recognizably similar form to how they are now? That's the history of traditions as opposed to the composition that's in front of us. So that's what I would do with the Balaam text from Deir Alla.
Yeah, and it sort of indicates that they're drawing from older sources. Balaam is like this legendary figure. Whether he exists or not is another question. But if they're going to include him in Numbers 22, what that tells me is that whoever's writing the Pentateuch, the Torah, is aware of older legends. It's no different than when they mention Malcolm of the Ammonites, and that's an older god that goes back to a certain period, and they just know about this god. It's just another character in the text that they know about. It doesn't necessarily mean we can anchor the Bible back then. It just means that they know about this text from back then. It's like there's parts of the Bible that show knowledge of some Babylonian texts, like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the flood stuff. And it's like, okay, does that mean the Bible goes back to 2000 BC or whatever that is? No, it just means that these texts were passed down, and these stories were still known to later authors. That's what it's exactly. That's right. There are genuine traditions there, but that doesn't answer the question about this concrete question about when are the biblical books written. And as I said, that's already an anachronistic question, because I mean, you could have a really early part of a biblical book, which is then updated with other stuff and updated with other stuff. Because when we get actual physical evidence of biblical texts, as you said, from the 3rd century BCE onwards, we have this state. We don't have a massive amount of evidence, but we have this state of fluidity in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That what the Greek is often translating is quite different to what we have in our traditional Masoretic text. So we know that there's this fluidity to biblical traditions, or even in the later part of the attestation of the biblical text in those last centuries BCE. So you might infer back that there is a similar fluidity going on for centuries before that. But what any of these books looked like 300 years before they're attested, I'm that cautious scholar who's I'm not really sure. I don't know what it would look like those centuries before. I'm not opposed to the idea that these books might have existed hundreds of years earlier, but I don't know what form that they had in that particular early period. Yeah, and uses words like Elohim rather than Elohim. I'm wondering if that's something we find in the Bible anywhere at all, or if that's some different older way of saying the gods. And also on top of that, and as far as our inscriptions go of Hebrew that we find, what is your analysis of those in comparison to the Bible?
The vast majority of the inscriptions are more day-to-day sort of stuff, like the Arad Ostraca, and the Lachish Ostraca are two of our biggest. They're military correspondence, and so they're interesting in their own way. And occasionally, like one of the Lachish Ostraca briefly mentions, "Oh, there's a prophet here," and he gives a message, "Beware," or something like that. So we see prophets going around, or there's like a document this prophet wrote. So you can see prophets writing, the little hints like that. But it's mostly that sort of day-to-day military sort of correspondence. We don't get a lot of stuff that's really literary. We get some like maybe hymnic stuff from like Quintilla la Jure, etc. like that. One really big thing we get on the amulets from Ketef Hinnom, we get what looks very close to being the text of the priestly blessing from Numbers chapter 6. So there we kind of have a biblical text already existing, usually dated around 600 BCE. So we do have a text there that attests to something that we now find in our book of Numbers. Does that prove that Numbers existed at the time, or just that for me, just it proves that the priestly blessing in some form existed already at that particular time? So again, another one of those. It shows that biblical texts are reflecting much earlier tradition. So we do get things like that, but mostly our inscriptions are not on the literary end of it. We don't get like from Ugarit where we get whole epics about Baal and all that sort of stuff. We just don't get that for our Hebrew evidence.
And that sort of makes me want to just kind of throw up a little, just to keep everything fair and to show how that we're not being biased here. We're acknowledging that the Hebrew Bible is aware of a lot of older traditions that are being preserved. Like you mentioned a few minutes ago, it's not just made up out of thin air in the 3rd century or 2nd century BC. It's definitely passing down older stuff. It definitely knows about its kings going back to however, even if David exists or not, it's going some sort of house of David or whatever. And it knows about they know about their past, and they're passing down some traditions. They might even have sources that do go back to that period that they're using, and then they're just passing them down and reconstructing them and redacting them or whatever the case is. That's what it seems like to me is what's going on here. I think that's the most balanced approach on this, right?
Yeah, that would be where I would go with it. I'm not again, if someone demonstrates to me that so this particular part of the biblical tradition is definitely a lot earlier than I thought, I'm okay with that. I'm a flexible sort of guy, you know.
Yeah.
I'm not really sold on any particular dating of, say, the Pentateuch or construction of how the Pentateuch came together. That's not really my current research is Daniel Enoch. So I'm in the late apocalypses and things like that. That's where I have maybe more sort of definite ideas. But Daniel's a little bit strange in terms of dating. But I'm just saying that I'm not someone who has definite ideas about, I know how the Pentateuch was put together, for example. So I'm open to finding things are earlier than I expected. I'm open to finding things are later than I expected. I think that's just what you've got to do as a scholar. You've got to listen to people who are experts in those fields and allow them to have their say and take on board what they're saying. Yeah.
So I guess like the conclusion that I'm coming to, and I think you might agree with this, is like the language of the Bible is not really hard data, as in like we can definitely know this is from this period, but more of like a palimpsest. Like it's like an evolution, or like a growing of like different ways and directions that the Bible goes into. And it's sort of like you can see the evidence of redactions and changes over time. And what you're left with what we're looking at is a rolling text, really, a text that's been like almost like a living document over time, being updated and changed through the Hellenistic period until we get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then we can that's when we could finally actually look at actual physical copies of these texts.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. The language, as I said, is going to be a mixture of stuff. Some of it for whatever reason could be really early. Some of it's going to be later, and I at this stage we don't know enough to be able to pull bits out of it in that particular way. So again, yeah, it is that idea that just as we think the traditions have developed over time, the books have developed over time, the compositions have developed over time. So it's picked up language from different eras. Mostly, it is the same. Whatever type of part of the Bible, we have very similar language. The verb system is basically the same in classical Hebrew down to the Dead Sea Scrolls. People know how to do the basics here. We're more talking about the text will pick up some weird things here and a few weird things there. One day we might be able to know more details. That weird thing's definitely related to this time period, but at the moment it's kind of like that, kind of like a snowball that's gone down. It's just picked up a whole pile of different things, and some of them may definitely be later than other ones, but it's difficult for us to know at the moment, just simply because it's a mixture of early and late, different people writing in different places, different scribes copying, changing the text. Because by the time we get to Dead Sea Scrolls, as I said, we'll get one scroll that does one linguistic feature one way. I did a lot of work on the Book of Samuel, so the Dead Sea Scrolls, Samuel might have a different linguistic profile in this linguistic feature than the traditional text. What's the original one? Probably neither of them. I don't know. But we've just got this process going on over time of things being updated, and that's just in line with what we think generally with the way that the Bible has come about. So what we're saying about the nature of the Hebrew Bible is fully in line with what everyone else is saying about this gradual process of development of the traditions.
That's interesting. Do you think that some of the approaches that we get from like Hornkohl, for example, are a little too optimistic and kind of looking for the kind of cherry picking data to sort of fit a narrative more than you think that's been being scientific?
I think Hornkohl is definitely using his methodology, and I think the methodology is problematic, but he's scientifically applying his methodology, but It's not necessarily getting him to the right place. Actually, Aaron in his latest book says that he's explicitly says, I'm being more optimistic here than a lot of other people would be. In other words, probably looking to us as well. We're much more pessimistic about it. So Aaron Hornkohl is aware that he's at one particular end of it, but he's much more optimistic about what we can do with the linguistic data. So I wouldn't say it's unscientific. I would just say that the methodology is well applied by Hornkohl within the logic of his own system. We would just say that the methodology itself is flawed, and therefore you're not going to get a good answer by using that methodology. That it's not going to work by applying it to the texts as we have them.
Yeah, I mean, would you agree that until we have more like firmly dated materials or some primary source or something to compare it with, it's hard to pin exact dates at all. It's hard to even get us into a specific century at this point. What are your thoughts on that before we close this out?
No, definitely. I call on all you archaeologists out there. Dig up some more sources would be fantastic. Especially more language sources, because I mean, the nature of how small our corpus is. Whenever a new inscription is discovered, quite often scholars will put together a whole book about this new inscription in Hebrew, just because it's so exciting. Whereas in Akkadian, there are all these cuneiform tablets that have been sitting around. No one's ever had time to look at them because there are so many. We're just so poor on those sort of sources. So please dig us up some more.
But that tells you something about like where we're at and how much we kind of special plead for biblical languages. Because like we find one little Hebrew inscription, and all of a sudden, like you said, there's thousands of articles written about it. It's inspected. It's completely looked into completely. And one of the you mentioned archaeologists need to get out there and start digging and finding stuff. Like I forgot to even ask you what your thoughts on Elephantine. We find this Jewish colony, and we look in like you would expect to dig there and go, oh, we want Jews who call themselves Judaios or Yahudim. I mean, in Hebrew, they call themselves this. They worship Yahweh. They say they come from Jerusalem. They're interacting with Jerusalem. They're writing letters back and forth to Jerusalem. They're clearly Jewish, clearly a Jewish colony. Perfect time capsule. They get there around 580 BC, something like that, and they live there up until 400 BC. This is after, this is pre-exilic, right? And so like all this stuff should be there somewhere, or at least something. and then there's nothing. What are your thoughts on that? And then that's the last question.
It's fantastic. I would defer to scholars like Gad Barnea, etc., like that, who are studying. They're perfectly right to point to. It's such a weird time capsule, as you said. You know, they're not. There's so many things. Like, I mean, they don't know about the centralization law that is only supposed to be a temple in Jerusalem. They have their own temple there, and they worship other gods as well. They take oaths by other gods, and so many weird things. And there's a few references like to the Sabbath or something like that, but they're clearly doing work on the Sabbath and things like that. That doesn't necessarily, I mean, people breaking a commandment doesn't necessarily mean the commandment doesn't exist, obviously. Otherwise, you'd think there were no road rules. But nevertheless, there are those things there. So I agree that that's a very concrete piece of evidence that there's a Jewish community in the 5th century BCE who don't really seem to be, like a Torah observant community or something like that. They're not what you might expect from the biblical story as we're getting it elsewhere. So it's something I've looked at a lot over the years, and things. I'm very interested in it, but I'd point to the specialists on that. I think what Gad Barnea, etc., is writing is really, really interesting on that particular community. Also the Babylonian community and Al Yahudu, etc., like that, etc. He also points to the lack, or other scholars talk about the lack also of evidence of this sort of Torah keeping community that we might expect from our understanding of the biblical tradition. So definitely really interesting.
Yeah, and a lot of pushback against that is like, oh, this is an argument from silence, but it's not. It's pointing out that there's just no evidence. It's like, it reminds me of Graham Hancock in the ancient civilization theory, where they're like, oh, we just haven't found it yet. So it must. You can't say it doesn't exist. We just haven't found it yet. Well, it's like you can't just use that as a get out of jail free card. We're talking about nothing, no evidence. That's a very substantial thing. So,
yeah, that's right. There's arguments from silence which are weak, and there are arguments from silence that are quite strong. So that's that's something that you can't just say all arguments from silence are not worthwhile, because I mean, we do it all the time. Every day we infer from absence of something to just in our day-to-day life. So it's a normal part of reasoning. So yeah, I think a big argument from a big silence like that is something that needs explanation for sure.
Yeah. Any last takeaways about some of the problems that you think are facing dating biblical text, and anything else like that?
I think I've said, probably repeated myself, what the main points, but that idea that we're not arguing that the language proves things are early, proves things are late, but just that there are problems with it. It can't just be used as this is the answer to everything. Bring it in dialogue with other methods is what we're really pushing to do. The idea that multiple methods need to come together, and language is definitely not something that we should just ignore. We're not claiming that it's just completely useless, but we're arguing that you need to look at it in context of what other people are doing. So just bringing things together in that way is probably all I think we're arguing. Yeah,
that's very, very well said. And what kind of articles and books you got coming out? I have links in the description to your books that are already out right now, so that stuff's in there.
Yeah, we're there is probably not so much from me, but I know that Robert Martin and another scholar, Martijn Nair, are producing work which is dealing with spelling patterns, which are often made into linguistic dating arguments as well. So there's some new work coming out. My own research at the moment, I've stepped away a little bit, except for occasional forays from the linguistic stuff. So I'm actually working more on Daniel and Enoch these days, which is quite a different field of study, even though Daniel is one of those late biblical Hebrew books. So I haven't worked so much on the language recently. So that's another talk we can have about Daniel and Enoch. That's something else. Yep.
For sure. And I just want people to know linguistic dating of the biblical text. That's the big one that you wrote with Robert Rezetko. And
Yeah, Martin Ehrensvärd, but also Historical Linguistics of Biblical Hebrew is the one we put out in 2014, which reflects kind of like the second stage of our scholarship. First stage, we really focused on within the theory itself, does it make sense? And then some of the pushback was, I didn't read your book, but I know you're wrong. But there was some very helpful feedback. Well, you can't argue against that, can you?
Right.
But
I've heard that so much. I've heard that so much.
But then we also got some really helpful feedback from linguists saying that the discussion so far isn't grounded enough in historical linguistics. And so that second book, Historical Linguistics and Biblical Hebrew, takes much more seriously the more general picture of how this work fits in with historical linguistics as a general discipline, rather than just working inside the theory like our early work does. So Linguistic Dating of Biblical Text, that first volume, really working within the old theory. The second volume is then expanding that and putting the whole discussion in the context of more general theory in historical linguistics.
Well, links for that are all in the description. And yeah, thank you for your time. And I think we'll have some more of these conversations in the future. And yeah, that's it. You have just attained.
Excellent.
You have just attained
Excellent.
true gnosis.